America is essentially a dream. It is a dream of a land where men of all races, of all nationalities, and of all creeds can live together as brothers. The substance of the dream is expressed in these profound words. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In 1929, less than a lifetime after the end of slavery, Martin Luther King Jr. was born in Atlanta. By the age of 14, he had moved quickly through school, skipping both the 9th and 12th grades, and entered Morehouse College, an all-black institution, at the age of 15. Before he graduated from college, he had already chosen his life's work and was ordained a minister when he was just 18. King began graduate studies in theology, first at Crozier Theological Seminary in Pennsylvania, then at Boston University. While in Boston, he met Coretta Scott, a music student and, like King, a Southerner. They were married in 1953. While he was in school, Martin Luther King studied the work of Mahatma Gandhi, who was leading India's fight for freedom from Great Britain. Gandhi knew that armed insurrection would justify British attack. His solution was nonviolent passive resistance, in which vast numbers of Indians boycotted British goods and disobeyed what they felt were unjust laws. Relentless, nonviolent mass confrontation eventually forced the British to abandon their claim to India. Martin Luther King saw that Gandhi's nonviolent approach to the struggle for freedom in India could work in the struggle for equal rights in America. The year was 1955. King's first job as a minister was at the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, just across the street from the Alabama State Capitol. Black bus riders who paid the same fare as whites were required by law to give up their seats to white riders and move to the back of the bus as the whites boarded. When all seats had been taken away by whites, the black riders had to stand. When a black woman named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat, she was arrested.
We, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, have been engaged in a nonviolent protest against injustices and indignities experienced on city buses.
On Monday, December 5th, 1955, there were no black passengers on the buses of Montgomery. That night, a committee was formed to carry on the momentum of the one-day boycott. Martin Luther King was elected its president.
We go back to the buses, let us be loving enough to turn an enemy into a friend.
At the age of 26, in his first action as leader, King gave an electrifying speech calling for an active refusal to cooperate with what he deemed an evil system.
We will be able to emerge from the bleak and desolate midnight of man's inhumanity to man to the bright and glittering daybreak of freedom and justice.
For Dr. King, the key to victory would be in never resorting to violence. The white citizens of Montgomery, however, had a different agenda.
All public carriers operating in Alabama are hereby directed to strictly adhere to all present existing segregation laws in our state or suffer the consequences.
More and more blacks began carpooling to ensure the bus boycott would succeed.
We, the Negro citizens of Montgomery, Alabama, do now and will continue to carry on our mass protest. It is trite but urgently true that if America is to remain a first-class nation, she can no longer have second-class citizens.
Boy, get off of here. Get off of
here. Death threats against King came almost daily.
You've had some rather personal and trying experiences yourself. Are you afraid? My attitude is that this is a great cause, it is a great issue that we are confronted with, and that the consequences from my personal life are not particularly important. It is a triumph of a cause that I'm concerned about.
In early 1956, Dr. King was arrested for the first time.
Ultimately, along the way of life, an individual must stand up and be counted and be willing to face the consequences, whatever they are. And if he is filled with fear, he cannot do it.
The attempts to intimidate King and his calm response accelerated his rise to true leadership in the black community.
We feel that this protest which we are involved in is constitutional. And to deny us that right would be to deny our constitutional right as citizens of the United States of America.
As the black leaders had hoped, the Montgomery bus boycott achieved national attention. Finally, on November 13, 1956, a year after the arrest of Rosa Parks, the Supreme Court declared bus segregation illegal. Dr. King had demonstrated his skills as a leader and had experienced his first triumph in the fight for equality.
This is the way that we will get out of this dark night of oppression and make of this nation a better nation. It means that we can stand up, allow the opposition to know that we will not accept injustice. We will stand up against it with our lives, but we will never stoop down to the level of violence and hatred. And we will come to that point when we will be able to convince him that a new world is emerging.
The next year, 1957, King and others formed the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, SCLC. This important group trained people in the methods and principles of nonviolent resistance, thus creating a core of leaders for the expanding civil rights movement, which would soon reach enormous nationwide proportions. Like many other black leaders, he was arrested numerous times for activities in violation of what were deemed repressive laws throughout the South. King would later write, "I was proud of my crime. It was the crime of joining my people in a nonviolent protest against injustice. It was the crime of seeking to instill within my people a sense of dignity and self-respect. It was the crime of desiring for my people the unalienable rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It was above all the crime of seeking to convince my people that non-cooperation with evil is just as much a moral duty as cooperation with good."
And we feel also that one of the great glories of American democracy is that we have the right to protest far right. This is a non-violent protest. We are depending on moral and spiritual forces, using the method of passive resistance. Even if we have to receive violence, we will not return violence.
I draw the line in the dust and toss the gauntlet before the feet of tyranny, and I say segregation now, segregation tomorrow, and segregation forever.
"1960 was a critical year for the movement.
The clock of destiny is ticking out.
All right, let's stop it right here.
The hour is late, and we must act now before it is too late.
Earlier that year, a handful of college students in Greensboro, North Carolina, were driven out of anger and frustration to challenge the practice of denying service to blacks. The black students occupied a lunch counter at Woolworth's, where they were ordered to leave.
This problem must be solved in the United States because segregation and discrimination are morally wrong.
Within a few days, students were filling the seats at lunch counters throughout the city, and a new term, as well as a new tactic in the struggle for civil rights, was born: the sit-in. King welcomed the spontaneous new direction in civil rights activities and became involved with the student movement early, realizing the importance of supporting a younger generation in the struggle for equality. 1960 was a presidential election year, and in John F. Kennedy, many African Americans saw a chance for the first meaningful government action in the cause of equal rights and equal justice. America's black leadership strongly supported Kennedy.
And I would say that there are some things that we must continue to do in order to make the American dream a reality and save our nation in this hour.
On Election Day, most groups were divided evenly between Kennedy and his opponent, Richard Nixon. Only black Americans voted overwhelmingly for JFK. Kennedy won, but only by an extremely narrow margin. The African American vote may well have won the presidential election for John F. Kennedy. However, the hoped-for comprehensive national civil rights legislation was slow in coming. In 1961, as the civil rights movement spread, more whites joined in demonstrations against discrimination. To fight segregation and travel between the states, groups of black and white freedom riders began traveling together by bus throughout the South, challenging discriminatory laws. The federal government was beginning to react. In 1961, segregation was officially ended in interstate travel. Advances in civil rights were not without their ever-increasing cost in human lives. In June 1963, Medgar Evers, head of the Mississippi chapter of the NAACP, the oldest civil rights organization in America, was shot and killed outside his home. But the pressure for change continued, and the pressure was never greater than in 1963. Early in the year, Dr. King and other black leaders decided to focus on what they called the most segregated big city in the United States, Birmingham, Alabama. The black leaders planned a highly visible demonstration of their demands for equality. On April 12, 1963, 2 weeks after the birth of his fourth child, Dr. King, Reverend Ralph Abernathy, and 1,000 others marched toward downtown Birmingham. The marchers were in deliberate violation of an order by Police Commissioner Bull Connor, expressly forbidding demonstrations. The mass arrests began. As expected, King and Abernathy were arrested and jailed along with many others. King was held for 24 hours in solitary confinement until President Kennedy personally interceded with Birmingham officials. On May 2, 1963, a large group of black children joined the Birmingham protests. After a speech by King, they moved toward downtown. Again, the police began making arrests. The same buses that transported the children to segregated schools were now being used to haul them to segregated prisons. Before the day was over, almost 1,000 children were in jail. A day later, another 1,000 children joined the march. This time, the authorities resorted to violence. The marchers were blasted with fire hoses, beaten with clubs, attacked by police dogs, and gassed. At last, on May 10, 1963, under pressure from the federal government and from outraged world opinion, the leaders of Birmingham accepted the demands of the freedom marchers. Having witnessed the abuse of power by Alabama authorities to the humiliating images of American violence and injustice being spread throughout the world, President Kennedy had seen enough.
The events in Birmingham and elsewhere have so increased the cries for equality that no city or state or legislative body can prudently choose to ignore them.
Kennedy agreed to push landmark civil rights legislation through Congress.
Next week, I shall ask the Congress of the United States to act, to make a commitment it has not fully made in this century to the proposition that race has no place in American life or law.
In June, Dr. King and civil rights leaders met with the president to announce plans for a march on Washington in support of the Civil Rights Act. The historic March on Washington took place in August 1963. As King and the others predicted, enormous numbers, black and white, gathered to show the time had come to end the discriminatory treatment of black Americans.
We, through our struggles, through our suffering, through our sacrifice, will be able to achieve the American dream. And this will be the day when all of God's children, black men and white men, Jews and Gentiles, Protestants and Catholics will be able to join hands and sing in the words of the old Negro spiritual, free at last, and God Almighty, we are free at last.
The day was a landmark in American history, and the high point was a speech by Dr. King that stands as one of the most important, beautiful, eloquent, and stirring orations in the English language. That day, King told of his dream of equality for his children, his people, and his nation. King's words made many Americans feel free for the first time in their lives. In September, less than a month after the march, a black church was bombed in Birmingham during Sunday services. 4 young girls were killed. As always, King deplored the violence, but he urged his followers not to stoop to violence themselves. But freedom marchers and civil rights advocates were not the only ones to experience violence. As President Kennedy at last committed himself to passage of the Civil Rights Act, his popularity dropped dramatically. President and Mrs. Kennedy arrived by plane in Dallas. They began a motorcade in open limousines into the heart of the city. And there in Dallas, John F. Kennedy was shot and killed. President Johnson, a Southerner, was much cooler toward King and the civil rights agenda than Kennedy had been. But he pledged to complete Kennedy's work on the Civil Rights Act. He knew even better than Kennedy how to achieve consensus on legislation. One of Johnson's first and greatest achievements was passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. This bill was the most important civil rights legislation signed into law since the 15th Constitutional Amendment of 1870. It guaranteed the right to vote to all male citizens without regard to race, color, or previous enslavement. The new federal law of 1964 prohibited discrimination for reasons of color, race, religion, or national origin in public schools and employment. Dr. King, for his leadership, was named Time Magazine's 1964 Man of the Year. And later in 1964, he became the youngest person ever to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. But passage of the Civil Rights Act did not mean that the struggle was over. Violence against the movement continued to rage. Bombings, burnings, and killings were regular events throughout the South. For Martin Luther King, winning the world's most respectable prize, the Nobel, did not mean he was about to retire to the life of an elder statesman. In 1964, for the first time, King experienced violence directed against him by blacks, as he had many times by whites. During an appearance in Harlem, he was assaulted by black Muslims, though King realized consensus in the movement would be increasingly difficult to achieve. He pressed on with his program of civil disobedience, peaceful resistance, and what he called non-cooperation with evil. And where many of the more militant factions were speaking of whites as the enemy, King repeatedly insisted that the brotherhood of man transcended all races, religions, political, social, and economic differences. After passage of the Civil Rights Act, King's next major objective was the achievement of full voting rights. Many whites were frightened at the prospect of the black majority voting sympathetic leaders into office. An attempted march from Selma to Montgomery was met with massive police resistance, arrests, violence, and the murder of a white clergyman. Finally, under federal protection, the march was able to proceed over 5 days to the Alabama state capitol. There, King told tens of thousands of supporters that the battle is in our hands. The march gave much-needed support to President Johnson's push for voting rights legislation. At last, on August 6, 1965, President Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act into law. Another fundamental right guaranteed by the Constitution was at last won by America's African-American citizens. With the passage of the Voting Rights Act, Martin Luther King's struggle had achieved its last great success. From this time forth, he would broaden his focus to include issues of poverty, employment, and peace throughout the United States and the world. In early 1966, Dr. King began a major action in Chicago. There, he moved into a slum dwelling with the intention of organizing the poor. This was a courageous and controversial effort for King and Southern leaders who were focusing on the North for the first time. Later that same year, Los Angeles was shattered by the Watts riots. In 5 days of violence, 34 people were killed and hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property was destroyed. The nation seemed on the verge of insurrection. Perhaps peace was impossible in the United States, while we had 500,000 troops fighting in Vietnam. In this turbulent social and political climate, King realized he could no longer remain silent on the war. Despite the counsel of major advisors who warned that voicing opposition to the war would alienate some of the civil rights movement's strongest allies, King spoke out powerfully against America's involvement in Vietnam. Martin Luther King was arguably the most important and effective American leader to take a moral stand against our involvement in Vietnam. On April 3rd, he delivered a speech that made reference to the war abroad and the war at home in the same terms. Men for years now have been talking about war and peace, but now no longer can they just talk about it. It is no longer a choice between violence and nonviolence in this world. It's nonviolence or non-existence. On April 4th, 1968, Dr. King stepped out onto the balcony of his motel room in Memphis, where he had been meeting with Ralph Abernathy, Jesse Jackson, and others. From across the way, a single shot was fired. Martin Luther King fell dead, murdered at the age of 39. James Earl Ray was convicted of the murder of Martin Luther King. King was a man with extraordinary gifts. A dreamer with a vision of equality he shared so generously for the good of humanity. A hero of magnificent courage, eloquence, and inspiration. A father of 4 young children, a leader with a lifetime of yet untapped potential.
We will be the participants in a great building process that will make America a new nation. We will be able to transform the jangling discords of our nation into a beautiful symphony of brotherhood. This is our challenge. This is the way we must grapple with this dilemma. We will be a great people. Let us have faith in the future. I know it's dark sometimes. And I know all of us begin to ask, how long will we have to live with this system? I know all of us are asking, how long will prejudice blind divisions of men, darken their understanding, and drive bright-eyed wisdom from her sacred throne? When will wounded justice, lying prostrate on the streets of our cities, be lifted from this dust of shame to reign supreme among the children of men? Yes, when will the radiant star of hope be plunged against the nocturnal bosom of this lonely night?
200,000 Americans, black and white, walked slowly through the sun-baked streets of Atlanta, following the mule-drawn sharecropper's farm wagon that carried his casket. In the aftermath of King's death, riots broke out in over 100 cities. Tens of thousands were arrested.
Ashes to ashes, dust to dust.
Martin Luther King provided a more constructive call to arms when he said, "Nonviolence is a powerful and just weapon. It is a weapon unique in history, which cuts without wounding, and ennobles the man who wields it. It is a sword that heals." With America still immersed in violence and injustice, what has survived of the legacy of Dr. Martin Luther King? In 1955, before Martin Luther King entered public life, in much of the United States, Americans of African descent could not even vote. King's work had made it possible for Edward Brooke to be elected the first black U.S. Senator. In 1967, Thurgood Marshall was sworn in as the first black Supreme Court Justice. That same year, Carl Stokes and Richard Hatcher were elected the first black mayors of major U.S. cities. In 1968, Shirley Chisholm became the first African-American woman elected to Congress. In 1992, Carol Moseley Brown became the first black woman elected to the United States Senate. But if this seems like too little too late, remember that the legacy of Dr. King remains a call to personal action for profound and immediate positive change.
Ralph Waldo Emerson said in a lecture back in 1871 that if a man can write a better book, or preach a better sermon, or make a better mousetrap than his neighbor, even if he builds his house in the woods, the world will make a beaten path to his door. This will become increasingly true. We're going to have to take advantage of new opportunities. We must set out to do our life's work so well that nobody could do it better. We must set out to do a good job. We must not seek merely to do a good Negro job. If you were setting out to be merely a good Negro doctor, or a good Negro lawyer, a good Negro teacher, a good Negro preacher, or a good Negro skilled laborer, a good Negro barber, a good Negro beautician, you have already flunked your matriculation exam for entrance into the University of Integration. We must get ready. We must set out to do a good job, and to do that job so well that the living, the dead, or the unborn couldn't do it better. As I've said so often, if it falls your lot to be a street sweeper, go on out and sweep streets like Michelangelo carved marble. Sweep streets like Raphael painted pictures. Sweep streets like Beethoven composed music and like Shakespeare wrote poetry. Sweep streets so well that all the host of heaven and earth will have to pause and say, here lived a great street sweeper who swept his job well. This is it. You can't be a pine on the top of the hill. Be a scrub in the valley, but be the best little scrub on the side of the rill. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are.